which asserts itself in all sorts of ways in our thinking as well as our acting. You see. The role of the Oedipus complex in Freud. His book, Moses and Monotheism, in which belief in God is the projection of an Oedipus complex. You see. That is to say that the substructure here is the emotional life of Freud. Marx, yeah, there the substructure is the material conditions of existence and the alienation that creates. And because of the conditions of alienation from one's own labor, from one's own self, and so forth, you have again if you like, a non-rational substructure to the theories that you develop and the social structures that you build, you see. And if you've read the Communist Manifesto, you find the assertion that that all our moral standards are simply expressions of the class conflict. So you have this sort of thing in these three, and the name of Max Weber, the sociologist, belongs along here too. Because while Weber talks a great deal of values, they seem to be relative, the projection of ideologies. Yes, now, you referred to Rorty, but another writer who picks up on this very significantly is Alan Bloom. Trying to pull out of my mind the title of Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. How many of you have read that? I suspect maybe except for the center section in which he deals with these people. At least most people I talk to who've read Bloom haven't read the center section, which is very philosophical. Maybe you have. I hope so. But Bloom begins that book with the complaint that the contemporary university student talks as if there is no such thing as truth and falsity, right and wrong. Have you heard that before? Well, you've heard it today. Has lost any sense of personal identity and has no world view on which to ground any of those things. You see. Now that's his complaint. Alan Bloom is professor of social theory and at University of Chicago. Well, what he does is to trace this situation to these continental thinkers, whom he takes to be the source of the problem. I guess my reaction to it, and I wrote a piece responding to it, but my reaction is that that's not the whole story. That at least in the English-speaking world, the influence is as much, I think, from the positivist tradition, with its assertion that the pragmatist tradition that we only have an instrumental view of truth and meaning, the positivist tradition that all values are just expressions of emotion. You see, that whole thing. So there's a complex that has produced that in society. I think perhaps one of the ways in which Rorty is different from Bloom is that he does pull in the Anglo-American influences as well as the continental ones. Yeah. But this is part of the postmodernism of the day. Okay. All right. The influence of Nietzsche philosophically, think of Nietzsche around 1900, his influence philosophically certainly continued way through the first half of this century. People who sort of echoes what he's doing is Karl Jaspers. And most of the literature on existentialism talks about Jaspers, even though I think by now his influence is much diminished, but in the first half of the century quite prominent. Jaspers was not satisfied with what Nietzsche was doing. It seemed to him that that people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche put too much of a gap between human subjectivity, that is to say, these depth dimensions of the inner life, of which Nietzsche speaks, and Kierkegaard, far too much of a gap between those inner dimensions and what he calls the empirical existence which we have as beings in this world. If you like, there's too much of a gap between the scientific and the existential. And so what Jaspers does in a book of his called Reason and Existence, existence being the mean for existential authenticity. What he does is to point out that it shouldn't be either or, but rather both and. And he distinguishes three dimensions of human being. There is our empirical existence, what he calls Dasein, literally being there, just another object, another entity. There is consciousness as such. There he's thinking of Kant's emphasis on the transcendental ego, and Descartes' cogito ergo sum. There is that inner mental life. Then in addition, there is spirit, the term Geist in the European sense that we got familiar with in Hegel, that has to do with cultural creativity. The third has been stressed by the idealists, the second by the Enlightenment, the third by empirical science. And you don't really have authentic human existence, according to Karl Jaspers, until you have these three dimensions integrated appropriately, embraced, by virtue of some ground of being of which we become aware. Some all-encompassing ground of being, the Umgreifende. It's the term he uses. What Jaspers talks about then is transcending a purely impersonal, inauthentic, empirical kind of existence. Transcending simply that Enlightenment notion of being a conscious, rational being, transcending even the life of the culture. Do you get the Kierkegaardian note in this? Stages on life's way, you see? Transcending all of that in an act of faith that begins to sound almost as if it's religious, you see. And the identity, the nature of that transcendent being, the all-encompassing being, is something we only speak of in symbols and ciphers. We can't conceptualize it. It's as if in Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, the triad of art, religion, and philosophy is such that you can have your artistic symbols, you can have your religious symbols, but there's no synthesis. That is to say, you can't have the philosophical conceptualization. And so what is involved is an existential kind of attitude rather than a cognitive grasp in the act of faith. Well, Karl Jaspers, interesting person. His wife was a Jewess, and when, I forget which city it was liberated by the Allies in the invasion of Germany, it was discovered that Jaspers and his wife were listed to be deported to the extermination camp the following week. So he just escaped in that way. All right, Nietzsche. Yeah, and I think Jaspers is a good critique of Nietzsche. What he's caught is simply one limited aspect of human concern. The creativity of the human spirit, that third dimension, without the others. What I want to do then is to go on to our next particular topic within this business of existentialism, namely to try and introduce what is phenomenology in the 20th century. We recognize that the term, the method, is rooted in Hegel, all right. But 20th century phenomenology is much more developed, much more complex, and I think even if we're going to simply talk about existentialism, we have to understand phenomenology. The history of the thing goes something like this, that you have Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in the first phase of existentialism in reaction against the Enlightenment. Okay? Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And you notice that their work is indeed descriptive. It's more like an introspective kind of psychology, of self-discovery or something of that sort, than anything else. There's no rigorous philosophical method involved. But as you move into the 20th century, you find that influence of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is combined with the more rigorous phenomenological method that is being developed out of the original Hegelian roots.